Listen, we already know what could have been for a competitor to the top webcomics like Solo Leveling and Tower of God, but where only a select few will get treatment like Solo Leveling, we unfortunately have to deal with the occasional Tower of God Season 2s as well. Now, I'm not here to beg on the anime for its lack of animation or relatively cheap feel, since quite frankly, anything that could be said has already been said hundreds of times over. No, instead I'm here to do what I always do. I'm here to show you what it is the story really has to offer. This includes the lore behind Arthur's old world and who he was before, along with a rather comprehensive breakdown of the way magic works. It's actually pretty interesting as far as power systems go. Keep in mind this won't be a continued series like how I did with Solo Leveling, but perhaps this one episode might be able to salvage your opinion on a series that deserves so much more. Alright, Episode 1, The Rebirth of the King, covering chapters 1 to 4 from the web novel and chapters 1 to 5 from the webcomic. Much of the whole reincarnation stuff you'll recognize as heavily inspired by Mushoku Tensei, but it was in between all that growing up that a lot of lore from his past life was given to us. This helps us understand who Arthur is a little bit better since it gives context to the person he was before. So, if we set aside the speedrun of Arthur's early formative years, we get to his perspective on the world and how it compares to his old one. The first instance was during his journey into Ashpur, which was a basic outpost where people could shop for various everyday necessities. The part about it that shocked him the most, though, was that every person was able to carry weapons around no problem. That and his surroundings was something he described as archaic. Over time, he'd come to see just how archaic it was, since transportation was limited to horse-driven carriages and sailboats, while weapons were only regulated while visiting those with authority. Sure, soldiers carried concealed weapons in his past life, but that was never solely for killing like how they seemed here. They were always simply to deter crimes from happening. Now, watching his dad revealed he was a much better fighter than he thought, since his fists carried enough force to break the sound barrier while his movements were fluid enough to leave zero openings. He was a high-tier fighter who in Arthur's past life would have been the leader of a squad of soldiers. As for who he was in this life, as a former B-class adventurer with lots of experience, he was part of several parties that went on expeditions to search for treasure and complete guild quests. His climb to the B-class was rather fast for a 28-year-old, and it was an impressive title to hold considering the rarity of A and S ranks. In fact, for Alice, who was an employee of the guild hall herself, not once had she ever seen an S rank. Now, it was at the guild hall that Reynald would meet Alice, and eventually the two would settle down to live the life we see here. Next, Arthur would discover the hierarchical structure of society wasn't far too different from his old world, since power and wealth determined one's rank within it. The key difference setting these two worlds apart, though, was the lack of technology and the existence of magic instead of ki. Now, something I found rather interesting which explains this scene here is that war in his old world had become obsolete. Should there be a dispute between countries, then a duel between their rulers would be carried out to determine the victor. These were battles limited to the use of only ki and close combat weapons, so that meant kings in his old world had to be the best of the best. They were the strongest fighters each country had to offer. Smaller disputes were handled with mock battles between smaller platoons, but never was there all-out war. So, with Arthur being the king of his own country, we learn he was the strongest fighter of his own nation. He'd out-dueled numerous competitors from different countries and even fought his own people in order to maintain his position. That being the case, when it came to swordsmanship and controlling ki, in his life before, Arthur was second to none. He had honed his personal strength and leveraged it to become the ruler we see here. This system of monarchy was one shared between this new world too, since the continent he was on housed kingdoms each ruled by a king and their royal family. Unlike the kings of his old world, though, these ones here were chosen based on lineage. That was easy enough for Arthur to wrap his head around, but what wasn't was the whole premise of magic. You see, where ki was more this inner power strengthened over time, channeled through the body then utilized to reinforce it or a weapon, magic was power stemming from the outside. Its foundations were built upon the mana that existed in the atmosphere. This begged the question of would one's mana run out, since it was the size of a person's ki center that limited the amount of ki they could use. That being the case, Arthur wondered if the same applied to a person's mana core. With mana propagating all throughout the atmosphere, he wondered if one could infinitely pull from the source that was always readily available to them. In his old life, Arthur's ki center was never the biggest, but he was considered a prodigy with the way he utilized it. The way he efficiently and effectively channeled the ki he had paved his way to the top as one of the strongest duelists. Mana seemed to work in a somewhat similar way, since just like how ki was channeled from the inside, mages used magic by absorbing mana into the part of the body I previously referred to as their mana core. It was a power that historically was classified as genetic. There were, however, many cases where the children of mages couldn't sense mana at all, so the general number of those who could wound up at around 1 in 100. For those in their adolescence all the way to their late teens, it seems only 1 in 100 fully develop their mana core. Now, it's when such an anomaly does finally happen that the event is referred to as an awakening. It's the time at which a mana core has fully manifested itself, and it's usually indicated by repellence of the surrounding mana followed by the forming of a translucent barrier around the awakened. The way this mana is then used dictates whether you're a conjurer or augmenter, so if it's applied to enhance the body with mana, that makes you an augmenter. If you're emitting mana to affect the outside world, then that makes you a conjurer. The former was a type most commonly used by warriors, while the latter was more so for mages. Naturally, each came with their own weaknesses and limitations too, so augmenters traded range for incredible strength, defense, and agility, while the conjurer's immense powers required the borrowing of mana from the outside. What I mean is that where augmenters only needed to use mana from within their mana core, conjurers required more than that in order to affect the world in the form of a spell. So, scientifically, both were classified as mana manipulators. They were categorized by the characteristics of their mana core, then their aptitude was measured via a multitude of factors. For augmenters, their talent was measured by the strength of the mana channels in their body, since that was the determining factor in how fast and efficient they were in relocating mana from their mana core. Conjurers were instead measured by the power of their mana veins, which for them dictated the effectiveness and speed at which they could absorb mana from the outside world. So, to recap everything I just said, first we have augmenters who enhance their body, fight at close range, and use mana channels to facilitate the movements of mana from their mana core. Then we have conjurers who are more traditional mages, casting spells via external mana absorption using their mana veins. It's unlikely a person will grow up to become both, since attempting to be proficient at both is said to be incredibly time-consuming and extremely unproductive. Not only that, but most people are born with a clear difference between their mana channels and mana veins. One is usually more effective than the other. It's once a specialty has been decided that whether augmenter or conjurer, the other half would usually be neglected. Like, since augmenters don't need to absorb mana from the outside, it's only natural they ignore their mana veins. Then, since conjurers don't release mana into their own bodies, they would decide to ignore their mana channels. The only time this distinction between them starts to diminish is when the mage starts to perform at an advanced level. So, Arthur's dad, though seemingly incompetent, is actually a decent augmenter and a less than average conjurer. His mother is classified into a more unique category, since in between conjurers and augmenters there also exists what's known as deviants, specifically those often referred to as elemental deviants and emitters. Emitters are what we'd consider the typical healer, but they're actually a rare breed due to the unique restorative mana they can cast unto others. That being the case, I suppose that makes them more conjurer than augmenter, but considering their unique trait, they were given the title of emitter. Now, if you're wondering how exactly this all works, well, for conjuring, absorbing mana into your body is only the first part. You would then circulate it into your mana core to stabilize and purify it, channel it into an appropriate conductor like a staff or wand, then speak the incantation which would serve as the mental controller, allowing your will to shape the mana into whatever spell you wanted. The more powerful the spell, the longer this whole process takes, and with each conjurer having an affinity for a certain element, they'd usually be more proficient in certain spells than others. That's not to say they can't become skilled with all elements, they just need the proper training. When it comes to how augmenting works, it all came down to how fast and precise one could transfer mana from their core to the rest of their body. It was a concept Arthur found most akin to ki, except ki couldn't draw additional power from the surroundings. The transfer of such mana did require incredible insight into one's own body, so to be able to effectively do so often required years of both mental and physical training. There are also no cases of elemental affinity here, since the mana used for augmentation is the purest mana possible. It's mana straight from the core of a person's body. This brings us now to the true limits both these mages face, coming in the form of a phenomenon known as backlash. For augmenters, this is the depletion of their mana core, while for conjurers, it's the overfilling of it. The former causes extreme bodily pain from overuse of augmentation, while the other is an overload from use of a spell beyond what the conjurer could handle. So that was everything Arthur learned from reading this textbook, and it's so far everything we know about magic in the world. The one thing Arthur didn't think was correct though was the fact only those who were older could manipulate mana. You see, with Ki being so similar to mana, Arthur figured he could manifest his mana core by focusing all the mana in his body into one single place. This was how children in his previous world did it, and it was often achieved through deep meditation and the sensing of the Ki inside them. For Arthur now, it was a feat he would start to attempt at the mere age of 7 months old. 2 years later, he would finally gather enough bits of mana within him to form a mana core, putting an end to the slow, arduous task he assigned to himself. It was so time-consuming, he honestly felt it would have been easier to learn how to walk on his hands or something. It was from this that Arthur understood why awakenings took so long for other people, since had he left the particles of mana to move around his body on their own, then he figured it would have taken them at least a decade to gravitate towards each other. It made clear the advantage of having the mental capacity of an adult. His increased cognitive ability allowed him to consciously will his mana particles together. He had done this back when he was a child in his past life, so it was essentially just a repeat of that. In the end, all it took was a daily ritual of focusing said particles as best he could, the result of which was an explosion which would destroy 75% of the house. This would be Arthur's awakening, and it was from this that one could easily tell whether he'd be an augmenter or conjurer. Reason being that the awakening of an augmenter would create a repelling force signifying dominant mana channels, while the awakening of a conjurer would create a sort of vacuum indicating dominant mana veins. Considering Arthur's awakening was a massive explosion outward, that would indicate he was an augmenter. Now, it was prior to this that both Arthur's parents would get their own POV describing their upbringing of Arthur, but that's something I'll leave for you to read for yourself. It does add quite a bit of depth to their characters, so if you are interested in the story beyond what I've said and what you watched in the anime, I'd recommend giving it a read since there's quite a lot more to it. This was just a quick video sharing some of the more interesting bits of lore left out from the first episode, since I do like talking about all this technical stuff. This one seems pretty comprehensive and well thought out, so I can only imagine it'll get more established from here. But anyway, that's pretty much all I gotta say about that. I did say I'd make a video on it, but now I'll be proceeding with catch-up for ReZero, Danmachi, and Overlord. So if you want to learn more about those series too, then feel free to subscribe. Until then though, ciao.